In December 1995, the best footballer on the planet came from a country that has never qualified for a World Cup. Not once, not before him, not because of him, not since. Liberia. Roughly 4.5 million people on the west coast of Africa. In 1995, it was 6 years into a civil war that would eventually kill around 200,000 of them. And the man who won the Ballon d'Or that December, ahead of Jurgen Klinsmann, ahead of Yari Litmanen, was Liberian. George Mane Weah. Born in Clara Town, a slum of tin and stilts built over a swamp on Bushrod Island, on the wrong side of Monrovia's bridge. Here is the part almost nobody says out loud. 1995 was the first year that award was even open to him. Until that season, France football handed the Ballon d'Or to European players only. They changed the rule, and the very first man to take it under the new rules was a striker from a country whose national team, at that exact moment, was being paid for out of his own bank account. Not sponsored, not subsidized, paid for. The kit, the flights, the players' pocket money, the win bonuses. One man funding an entire international side, while he was under contract at AC Milan. Call it what it was, a private national team. That is where this starts. Where it ends is a question, and I want you to carry it the whole way through, because the answer is about 10 days old. He became president of Liberia. He served one term. He lost. He walked out of the mansion, and at the end of July, at 59 years old, he stood in front of a room of supporters and said he is coming back. So the question is not how a kid from Clara Town became the only African ever to win the Ballon d'Or. That story exists. You can find it in 20 places. The question is what it cost him. Because between the trophy in Paris and the office in Monrovia, there is a night in May of 1996 that most versions of this story skip completely. The night around 70 armed men walked into his house. He was in Italy. His relatives were not. And 4 months after that night, he scored the goal people still argue about. Start where he started, because the distance is the whole point. Clara Town, October 1966. Weah's parents separated when he was small, and he was raised largely by his grandmother, Emma Clongelale Brown. There were no academies. There was no scouting network. There was a dirt pitch, a ball that was rarely a real ball, and a neighborhood where the electricity was a rumor. He played for a side called Young Survivors, then a company team sponsored by a rubber firm, then Mighty Barole, then Invincible 11, the two biggest clubs in Liberian football, and between them, the entire stage the country had to offer. He was Liberian Footballer of the Year before he had ever left the continent, which sounds impressive until you realize what it actually meant. The ceiling had already arrived, and he was 19. In 1987, he moved to Cameroon, to Tonnerre Yaoundé, and that is where the tape started traveling. Not far. Cameroon to France, in an era before highlight clips, meant somebody physically watched you and believed what they saw. Somebody did. Arsene Wenger, then 38 years old and managing Monaco, got on a plane to Africa to sign a player nobody in Europe had heard of. Wenger did not send a scout, he went himself. That detail matters because for the next 4 years, European football would treat Weah as a discovery. And discovery is a word that quietly gives the credit to the man holding the notebook. Monaco, 1988. Weah arrived at 21 and adapted almost immediately. Quick, powerful, and technically absurd for a center forward built like that. Defenders in the French league had a specific complaint about him, and it was always the same one. He was too fast to press and too strong to knock over, and you could not have both. He won African Footballer of the Year in his first season in Europe. He won the Coupe de France with Monaco in 1991. Then Paris Saint-Germain, 1992. And this is a PSG most people watching have never seen. No Qatari ownership, no Galacticos, a club that had won exactly one league title in its entire history. Weah scored, and PSG won the second. the 1994 championship. He won 2 more French Cups there, and in the 1994-95 season, he finished as the top scorer of the Champions League with 7 goals, dragging that PSG side to a semi-final it had no business reaching. He was 28 years old. In most careers, that is the plateau. Milan came for him in the summer of 1995, and the 6 months that followed are the reason we are here. He scored for Milan. Milan won the Scudetto. And in the space of 1 calendar year, Weah collected the African Footballer of the Year award, the FIFA World Player of the Year award, and the Ballon d'Or. 3 trophies, 3 separate juries, 3 different sets of voters who had no obligation to agree with each other, and all of whom did. No African player had ever done it. In the 30 years since, no African player has done it again. Not Drogba, not Eto'o, not Yaya Toure, not Salah, not Mane, not Osimhen. The list of Africans who have won a Ballon d'Or begins and ends with one name. But hold the picture in your head, because this is the part that makes the whole thing strange. On the night he was handed the Ballon d'Or in Paris, he was the most decorated footballer alive. And roughly 3,000 miles south, the country on his passport had no functioning government, no reliable electricity in its capital, and a national team that could not afford to travel to its own qualifiers. Weah did not send a donation. He picked up the bill. Here is what funding a national team actually looked like. Weah paid for the Lone Stars kit. He paid the players spending money. He chartered flights so the squad could reach away fixtures during a civil war when commercial aviation into Monrovia was not a thing you could rely on. During the qualifiers for the 1998 World Cup, he covered the win bonuses and the cost of the away trips himself. He was not just the star. At various points, he was the star, the captain, the financier, and the man hiring and paying the coaching staff. There is no modern equivalent, and it is worth sitting with how strange that is. Imagine a current Ballon d'Or winner personally wiring the money that gets his country's squad onto an airplane, choosing who manages them when they land, and then playing the 90 minutes. And it nearly worked. Liberia reached the Africa Cup of Nations in 1996 and again in 2002. The only 2 appearances in the country's history, both of them on his watch, both of them substantially on his money. It never reached a World Cup. In the qualifiers for 2002, Liberia came within 1 point of it. 1 result on the final day in a group they had led. Nigeria beat Ghana 3-0, and that was that. Weah, the best player in the world in 1995, never played 1 minute at a World Cup finals. Then, May of 1996. Weah had gone public with a demand that the United Nations take Liberia over as a trust territory, effectively saying his own country's factions could no longer be trusted to govern it. That was not a neutral thing to say. Charles Taylor's fighters were the largest of those factions. Around 70 of Taylor's followers went to Weah's seaside home outside Monrovia. They took everything of value, and what they could not take, they destroyed. And then they burned the house. Some of his relatives were killed, others were assaulted. Weah was in Italy, preparing for a season with Milan. He found out by phone. And what I am about to tell you is worth the like and the subscribe on its own. 4 months later, the 8th of September 1996, Milan against Hellas Verona at the San Siro. A Verona corner was cleared to the edge of Milan's own 6-yard box. Weah collected it inside his own penalty area and started running. He ran through the Milan half. He ran through the center circle, where 2 Verona defenders came at him and 1 went to ground, and he spun away from both without breaking stride. He ran into the Verona half, into the final third, and from the edge of the box, he hit it low across the goalkeeper and inside the far post. 90-odd meters. 1 touch to start it, 1 touch to finish it. Milan won 4-1. Not everyone agrees on what that goal is. Some say it is the greatest solo goal in the history of Serie A, full stop, and that the context is irrelevant. Others say we remember it the way we do precisely because of who scored it and what had happened to him 4 months earlier. That we are grading the man, not the run. It's a debate worth having. What Weah did with the house is the part that stays with me. He rebuilt it. Then he found he could not live in it. So he turned it into a lodge, and he filled it with Liberia's national team players. He retired in 2003. 16 months later, he ran for president of Liberia, and he won the first round. And then he lost, badly in the runoff, to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a Harvard-trained economist who had worked at the World Bank. The line used against him during that campaign was simple, and it was brutal. The man cannot read well enough to run a country. He was 38 years old, and he had just been told that everything he had built was not the right kind of qualification. Most people, at that point, take the money and the statue and go quiet. Weah went back to school. He finished the high school education the war and the football had cost him. Then he enrolled at DeVry University in Florida, a man who had been named the best footballer on earth, sitting in a lecture hall in Miami-Dade County doing coursework. In 2011, at 44, 23 years after Arsene Wenger flew to Africa to find him, he graduated with a degree in business management. Then he went back and took a master's on top of it. Think about what that actually required. Not the studying. The decision to accept, in public, in front of a country that had just watched him lose, that the insult had a point. He also kept losing. In 2011, he ran as the vice presidential candidate on Winston Tubman's ticket. That ticket lost, and the campaign ended in a boycott of the runoff. Then, in December 2014, he stood for the Senate seat in Montserrado County, the county that contains Monrovia, and Clara Town, and the swamp he grew up over. His opponent was Robert Sirleaf, the son of the sitting president, the son of the woman who had beaten him. Weah took 78% of the vote. 3 years after that, he won the presidency outright, and on the 22nd of January 2018, he was sworn in. The first time in more than 7 decades that one elected Liberian president handed power directly to another. Now, the 6 years that followed are not a highlight reel, and this channel is not going to pretend they were. There were new roads and new schools. There was also inflation that hurt the people who had voted for him hardest, corruption allegations that would not go away, and in 2022, United States sanctions on senior officials inside his own government. Ask 100 Liberians about the Weah presidency, and you will not get one answer. In October 2023, he stood for re-election, and the country did something to him that it had never done to any sitting president in its history. It voted him out. 50.64% to 49.36%. Roughly 20,000 votes across an entire nation. Here is what he did next, and it is the reason this story is not just a football story. He did not contest it. He did not call the count rigged, or send his supporters into the street, or wait for the courts. Before the final results were even certified, Weah went on the radio, congratulated Joseph Boakai, and told the people who had voted for him to accept it. On the 22nd of January 2024, 6 years to the day after he walked in, he walked out and handed over the mansion. In a region where the previous decade had produced coup after coup, the most powerful thing George Weah ever did with a ball at his feet was put it down. And then, on the 31st of July 2026, in a hall in the United States, in front of his own party, he said 7 words. I will be a candidate in 2029. 59 years old, Ballon d'Or winner, former head of state, going again. There is one last number in this story. George Weah was, by the reckoning of 3 separate juries, the best footballer alive in 1995. He never played 1 minute at a World Cup because Liberia has never qualified for one, and it still has not. In November 2022, in Qatar, a 22-year-old winger ran onto a through ball and scored against Wales. Timothy Weah, playing for the United States. The first son of a Ballon d'Or winner ever to score at a World Cup. His father watched it from the presidential mansion in Monrovia.